Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. My guest today is Pat Borgen, who is the chair of the Department of Surgery at Maimonides Medical Center, where he also heads the Maimonides Breast Center. Pat was born in South Dakota, but he grew up in Louisiana, where he went to medical school and did his residency. He then went to Memorial in New York, where he did a lab fellowship, went on staff, became the head of the breast service, and spent the formative years of his career there. About 10 years ago, he made a major change by moving from Memorial Sloan Kettering to Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. He has dedicated a decade or more of his life to building cancer services for the population of Brooklyn and has made an enormous success of that. Outside of his work life, he remains a Southern boy at heart and is an avid fisherman, hunter, as well as enjoying his many motorcycles and TR6 Triumph, which he drives on a regular basis. Pat has much to say about his life in breast surgery, as well as some of the other aspects of life. So without further ado, we will go over and listen to the conversation today. Don't forget, please, to like and subscribe to the channel. And as always, I like to hear your comments about any of the interviews. I'm John Monson, and this is Surgeons' Lives. So, hey, Pat, so thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. Thanks for taking some time out of your day.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to talk to you.
As you know, this very informal and casual conversation is subtitled "Stuff That Matters," but I normally ask people to start, as I'll ask you to, with a little early history of your life, starting with the words "I was born in."
Thank you, John. I was born on a military base in North Dakota.
Huh?
My father was part of the U.S. military that built, I think, nuclear silos across Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota.
Yep.
He used to joke to protect us from the Canadians, and they never even tried to attack us. From there, he was hired by NASA as part of the Apollo moon project, and we lived in Seattle for a little while, in Huntsville, Alabama, and Titusville, Florida. And then they built the first stage of the Apollo rocket in New Orleans East on an old plantation called Michoud. And so I grew up, I lived the first 30 years of my life in Louisiana, blissfully hunting and fishing and riding dirt bikes and
Yeah.
and it's I trained down there in medical school residency, and then went to New York at 30 to do a laboratory fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Was hired onto the faculty in 91, and in 93 I became the chief of the breast cancer surgery service, a position I held until 2007 or so.
Was
And
was there medicine in the family, or that what drove you into medical school and indeed to surgery after that?
yeah, my father was an engineer's engineer, as you might imagine. Back in the 1950s and 60s, there was really no aerospace engineering. In fact, he was a civil engineer, sort of self-taught, and he always hoped I would follow his path and go into engineering. After the US government closed the Apollo moon project, after Apollo 17, he went into land development and land surveying, which in South Louisiana is about the worst occupation you can possibly have, between the snakes and the mosquitoes and the 100-degree heat. So I was pretty sure I wanted a job in the air conditioning. And I had two uncles that were physicians. My dad's oldest brother was a practicing OBGYN doctor at the Virginia Mason Clinic in Seattle. And my mom's oldest brother was a ENT head and neck surgeon in Boulder, Colorado. And he had gone to Tulane, which is my alma mater. And so I really got interested and double majored at Tulane in engineering and pre-med stuff. And just have loved it ever since.
I mean, you went to New York, as you say, Memorial, and essentially never left New York. But do you consider yourself a Southern swampy boy, or a traveling military brat? Yeah.
Yeah, the military thing really was just so early in our family's life. We were really in New Orleans for half of my life, and so I identify as a Southerner. I lost my accent at some point at Memorial. If you say y'all,
Yeah.
people sort of think you're kind of not intelligent, and so I really, over the years, worked on losing the Southern accent. But if I get on a plane, which I'm going to do in a few weeks, and I step off the plane in the humidity of New Orleans, the accent comes back instantly.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so that you spent a goodly number of years in what is either the world's number one or number two, depending on the argument between MD Anderson and Memorial on the whatever week of the day it might be. Um,
Yeah,
in what is an ivory tower of cancer care, etc. And then you you stepped across the bridge, literally and figuratively, to really an entirely different adventure. What was the
yeah.
ambition? Was
I
it a bigger office or more money or what?
yeah, I started at Memorial at a very young age. I was 30 years old. And what I saw was that it was a great place to start and not a great place to finish. And I saw giant after giant after giant sort of marginalized later in their career. And I really determined that the memorials and to some extent the MD Andersons, both great places, are built for rising stars, not risen stars. And so I resolved to go to an underserved area. My dream was to go back to New Orleans. I interviewed for the chair of surgery at Tulane University, was offered the position. New Orleans certainly had cancer services, but nothing along the lines of what Sloan was doing. And
Sure.
so I started looking at homes. I notified Murray Brennan, my chair, that I was moving to New Orleans. And then Hurricane Katrina came and wiped Tulane off the map and closed the hospital for some time. They didn't have to, but they let me out of the contract. There was really not a job. So I came back and but I had already made the mental step.
Yeah.
And someone asked me what I knew about Brooklyn, and I knew nothing. I was an Upper East Side snob. My office looked at Brooklyn for 17 years. And I came to realize that Brooklyn was 3 million people without a cancer center, and a very and underinsured population who could not go to the Sloans of the world. And so in 2006, I signed a contract to join a group that was building what is Brooklyn's first and largest cancer program. And that has been a true labor of love. I've been there 17 years. In 2009, I became the surgeon in chief for the hospital system. And I've hired about 100 surgeons. So we've got a completely closed faculty. And it's nascent. I know you visited us recently to look at our rectal cancer program, which is new. But these services were never in Brooklyn before. It's hard to imagine. Brooklyn is twice the size of the state of Louisiana. And for 10 years, we were the only cancer center there. So Brooklyn has really been just a marvelous, for me, marvelous second act.
Uh, when you went to Memorial um, for your lab fellowship, can you remember what your ambitions were? I mean, what did you see yourself being?
I I was hired by a Brit named Michael Osborne, who you might remember, and um, Michael was the son of a vicar from Bath. He used to be upset if I said Bath,
Yeah,
and he would correct me vociferously. And Michael was a real academic surgeon, and in a way, I aspired to be Michael Osborne. And so I also, it was sort of a Forrest Gump type of an existence where everything we touched worked. HER2 was just discovered, right place, right time. First paper on my CV says HER2 is a bad guy. BRCA1 and BRCA2 were discovered. My group discovered the BRCA2 founder effect mutation in the Ashkenazim. Um, the surgical changes that you're aware of between, mostly minimalization, mostly de-escalation.
yeah.
And so it was really lucky. It was really the right place at the right time to be an academic surgeon.
Must have been a pretty exciting existence, as you say, where everything you touch turned to gold.
I really, there were several things at Memorial Sloan Kettering that I appreciate now later in my life. One is it's a lot easier to fundraise at Memorial Sloan Kettering than in Brooklyn. That's lesson number one. Number two was I think early in my academic journey, the 6174 del T BRCA2 mutation, I got two Nature papers out of that, and I was 35 years old. I thought this is really easy,
Yeah.
nothing to this stuff. And so I really look back and just appreciate so fondly what I was able to do and how Memorial helped me do it. So I'm totally appreciative of that. I also have taken many of those lessons and rebuilt something important in Brooklyn. So
Yeah, and the other thing that is a huge privilege in somewhere like Memorial is the reality that for the most part you don't have to go out and market yourself to attract patients. The rest of the world does, apart from a couple of places, obviously. But the normal world is marketing for business, whereas you can focus on doing what you might call more important stuff than when you're working in Memorial. It's a great privilege.
it's definitely true. And it has its ups and downs.
Yep.
A lot of people that go to Memorial or MD Anderson sort of spend their whole career there, which is marvelous, wonderful. But when you go out into the real world, it's an entirely different
Yeah.
sport. And collegiality, um, being available, communicating with referring doctors is vastly more important. And that's a lesson that I had to learn over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
I also think that um, what I did differently in Brooklyn that I'm very proud of is I recruited for values first and ability second. So often as we recruited both fellows and young attendings, we counted publications and we looked at impact factor and we looked at, my goodness, how much intellectual horsepower does this person have? But we often didn't look at whether this was a compassionate, empathetic human being. And so what I like about my team in Brooklyn is that they're smart and they're well published, but they're really nice people. And for me, as a second act, that's really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's a very important statement. Certainly, when I was a chair in England, for 15 years, I focused on the ability and the CV and all of that sort of stuff. But as you get older, you realize it's a people thing. It's it doesn't matter how many grants you have. You have to get on with people, and it's an important communication, and it's not something that I certainly wasn't born with. I mean, it took me far too many years to work that out. Um,
Yeah.
and and
Yeah, we
go on.
have to we for us to be competitive, Memorial Sloan Kettering is 6 miles from my hospital. Now, the reality is that we're 50% under or uninsured, and Memorial's simply not built to take those patients.
Yeah,
But for the other half, we are in a competitive environment. And the way we have to win and the way we have been winning is by being nicer. Here's my cell phone number. I want you to call me. I want you to text me.
yeah,
Um, I think that there's a difference between taking good care of a patient and making them feel well cared for. And I hope that we do both in Brooklyn.
sure. And you had some, and you still have some great giants to look to in Memorial Murray, of course, as you say, and who still you still have a connection with Murray today.
Yeah, I do. My father passed away tragically after an automobile accident the same year that I was made the chief at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Murray became a very genuine father figure to me. And so Murray continues to come out to Brooklyn to give lectures, to give mock orals. He has officially retired from Memorial. And so he really spends more time at Maimonides than at Memorial, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
My residents are terrified of him appropriately, but he's just such a unique intellect, unique human being. I treasure every minute with him.
So one of the things that I often say to people when they're complaining about their job or, whatever is that, if you like what you do in a job 3 days out of five, it's probably okay. You're in an
Right.
okay job, and 4 days out of five is a fantastic job, and 5 days out of five just doesn't exist.
Right.
Really. When you're down
Yeah.
2 days out of five, maybe you're in the wrong place. But
Yeah.
we all have, parts of the week that we don't want to do. Some people don't want to go to the clinic, some people don't want to go to the committee meeting. For you, as a chair with a lot of balls up in the air to balance and work out, what's the best part of the week for you?
Yeah. I thought you were building up to asking what the worst part of the week was. So there's no bad part. I'm in the 4 or 5 day happy mode. What takes the most out of me is the clinic. I do 1.5 days a week. And sort of as an older surgeon, I get sent very advanced, multiply recurrent, often last resort cases. And I love it, but I find it exhausting. I give a little piece of myself, I think, to every patient that comes in. And those are the days where driving home, I am completely, utterly wiped out. Um, the other stuff, the administrative part, the recruiting in the building and surgery, I chair our research foundation. I'm the current acting director of our cancer center. The best part of the week is education. We've got a handful of fellows. We have a fairly large residency program. I still operate 2 days a week and love that to death. So the teaching, shaping the next generation is the fun part of the job for me. Um, and I'm just renewed my contract for 3 years, so I'm pretty happy.
Well, that means they're happy too,
Yeah, I hope so.
which is
Yeah.
which is a good thing. So, just before we move away from that a bit, in the career you've spent in the breast world, like many forms of surgery, like many forms of cancer, um, the whole story for breast cancer is wildly different in 2025 than it was when you started.
Yeah, it is. In 1987, the second most common operation done in breast cancer was a bilateral adrenalectomy as hormone ablative therapy, if you can imagine that.
Mhm.
Um, there were still surgeons doing, if not modified, radical or modified radical mastectomies going into the 1990s. We believed that the more lymph nodes you got out, the better surgeon you were. And man, we were aggressive.
Yeah.
And so there was a huge technical aspect. We ran out of systemic agents early, and so we would resect sternal metastases and reconstruct the chest with polymethyl methacrylate. And so it could not be more different today. But I think the surgeon's role is still incredibly important because we're the one that sets treatment sequencing. We're the one that explains the trajectory to patients. The minute the surgeon stops being on top of the intellectual part of breast cancer, then we've totally lost the race. These are small operations, technically not challenging. But the intellectual side of it, the complexity of breast cancer as a family of diseases, is really the exciting part of it.
Yeah, and it is interesting to remember back to those days when Bernie Fisher and Veronese were, talking about this as a systemic disease rather than a lymph node picking disease. And the resistance to that was enormous and
Yeah,
sustained.
yeah,
And
yeah.
still the resistance to consider that as a biological model in other cancers is, I think, perverse sometimes. I was talking to somebody recently on a site visit, and a young surgeon who was arguing about who should be doing rectal cancer in terms of the operation. And I said to him, "Listen, if your business model for success is taking rectums out, you're going to go bankrupt because 10 years from now, you're not going to be doing that many rectal cases. The number of anterior resections and abdominal repair is just plummeting in the US at the moment, and it's just scratching the surface.
Yeah, I was very blessed to know both Bernie Fisher and Umberto Veronese very, very well. And Veronese and I ran a meeting every year in Milan
Yeah,
in October. Um, and there were 40 countries represented at this meeting. And I also remember, I mean, he was so visionary. I would show up and say, "Boy, we have this new thing we're doing. It's so exciting." And he'd say, "Yeah, we've done 200."
yeah,
And you could not stay ahead of him. But I remember Murray Brennan. Breast cancer was not Murray Brennan's favorite disease.
no,
In fact, he used to say, "Thank goodness somebody wants to do this for a living." But in 1989, in Grand Rounds, he said concretely that, biology beats technique, and that was a long time ago, and that's what you're really referring to.
yeah.
If you think you're going to cure the world by a bigger rectal operation, it's just not going to happen.
Oh, for sure, and it disrupts businesses and careers. You know,
Yeah.
I say to people where you need to be developing skills is in regrowth of rectal cancer from a complete response because that's a different operation maybe, and
Right.
that there's going to be a business in that for a while. So. Um, so there you are. But when the lights go out, there's other stuff going on in your life. You have, I know you said too many hobbies. And
Yeah.
you and I have discussed your interest in motorized transport. Um, Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I was very blessed to have a father who grew up on a farm in South Dakota and wound up in a relatively high position with NASA. And that is to me is still extraordinary. And he had an expansive mind and planted in me interest after interest after interest. So in South Louisiana, I raced motocross. It was a different sport back then. It wasn't the circus act that
Yeah.
it is today. It was more beating your brains out on a muddy field. But we hunted, we fished. We always had a boat at every point during my life. Mostly offshore fishing, mostly deep saltwater fishing. Um, I have a sister who's a quite accomplished artist, and I've been painting most of my life, for better or worse. I've studied the piano for 35 years, and we have a band in the Department of
Yes.
Surgery, which is half Jewish, half Russian, and me. And it's called the Mazel Tov Cocktail Band. And we play about 14 or 15 performances a year. We have one coming up for Heart Month in February. So I love life. I love my time away from the hospital. About 2 years ago, I bought a boat up here in New York. I didn't have one before. And I've been fishing in the North Atlantic almost every weekend during good weather months. And so and the motorcycle hobby is still, I do about 5 or 6 vintage events a year with our team, which I still love that a lot.
And do you have what people resist referring to as a collection because they always feel as though they shouldn't admit to collecting old bikes or old cars, etc. But do you have more than one?
I um I do not have a collection. I have friends with collections, but I do have a bike for every occasion. So I've got my favorite bike is a 1999 BMW R1100 RS, which I've put thousands and thousands of miles on. It's my favorite road bike. My vintage motorcycle that I race is a Honda CL77, which is a 305cc scrambler from the mid 60s. I'm always worried that someone on a 10-speed bike is going to pass me in one of these events. Um, I've got a cadre of dirt bikes. I live on a farm here in Jersey, and I've got a couple of really nice old dirt bikes. So I've got the requisite Harley Davidson, which I ride in breast cancer events, and I always say that having a Harley is like being in love with a woman you can't stand. But they're good for parades. And recently, I've been helping a friend of mine. We're restoring a Moto Guzzi 850 from 1978, which is fun. So it's not a big collection, but they're bikes that I ride and that I enjoy, and I get a lot of pleasure from them.
You know, it's intriguing to listen to, but I'm sorry to say that is a collection. It is. Um, but we'll agree between us that it's actually just an interest.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bike for every occasion. We live on a little mom and pop farm here I'm in Monmouth County, New Jersey, and great trail riding, great forests around here, and I've got an old Suzuki 250 two-stroke that I run around, and it's just a lot of fun, a lot of fun.
And do you have the prerequisite for this in terms of broken bones and bent fingers or any of those things, or where have you been? What have you done to
No,
yourself?
I do. Although I think the crashes that I had as a youngster, I broke my left arm twice, um, multiple fingers. I'm a very, very careful, almost ridiculously careful rider now. I don't take chances. I don't ride in the city. I ride in the country, except for the vintage bike events, which are, I've actually retired from the Italian events. because they're a little bit adventuresome. Really just don't want to wake up in a hospital in central Italy. But I've learned a lot of lessons. I have two sons who ride, and they're all on the off-road dirt.
Yeah.
But those life lessons, bad judgment leads to good judgment, and I had a bunch of it.
Yeah, that's for sure. I stopped racing motorbikes when I realized that I used to see at the vintage events, the old bikers were the ones with the limp and the strange looking little finger and middle finger.
Yeah,
And I thought, well,
yeah,
it's not a lot of call for surgeons who have at least two
yeah.
fingers going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. These events, which are called Moto Giros, they sound like they're exciting. It's really just an endurance event. The Moto Giro d'Italia is a 6-day event on a really old motorcycle across country roads. And the idea is finishing.
Yeah.
Yes, we go fast, and yes, we have fun, but it's not really a race. It's an endurance competition.
Yeah, I was because my godfather was the importer. I spent most of my off-road stuff competing on Bultacos. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
um, great Spanish bike, family business actually. For
Wow.
many years,
Well,
Francisco
my
Bulto was his name.
what was his name?
Francisco Bulto, Bulto,
Wow.
was the family patriarch and owned the business.
Yeah,
This was
yeah.
back in the day. They don't. Uh, they've been morphed into something else now. And you have, if I recall correctly, you have an old British car, or
I do, but let me go back to the Bill Taco
yeah.
because
Mhm.
I was my lovely, lovely, lovely wife, um, about 7 or 8 years ago, bought me a Bultaco 360 Persang,
Yeah,
which, when you think about that massive engine in a two-stroke, it's just a ridiculously fast. That bike would pull the front wheel off the ground in every gear.
yeah.
The problem with the bike was it was a right foot shift, left foot brake. And if you have spent your life shifting with your left foot, that bike was a little bit dangerous. It was a little bit dangerous. And it also backfired so much that my neighbors would call Homeland Security every time I rode it. And I wound up trading it for the 850 Moto Guzzi that we're
Uh,
working right now. But I love that power plant on the Bultaco was extraordinary. So were you a Bultaco owner?
oh, many of them, yeah. And I raced a Persang. I got to the point of almost I was semi-supported by the factory, but I wasn't quite good enough to be good enough. But what I didn't like about it was not the right-hand shift, but it was the left-hand kickstart. Because I'm very right-handed, and
Yeah,
I just could not start the bike with my left foot. I
yeah,
had to get off the bike. That
yeah,
used to drive me nuts. Whereas all the Japanese bikes, the three Spanish bikes at the time were Bultaco, Ossa, and Montesa, and they
yeah,
all had that stupid kickstart on the
yeah.
left. Drives me
I
nuts.
wound up I wound up buying a roller starter, which made all the difference in the
Ah,
world because
sure.
if that thing backfired, it launched me up. I mean, it really, really did. But there's a guy in New York, north of he's up the Hudson someplace, and he will actually switch the
Ah,
shift
sure.
from
Yeah.
the left to the right. And I considered it actually.
So what about the four wheels then? If I recall, you have something what might have been
Yeah,
British Leyland.
yeah. I've owned three 911s in my life. The last one was in 1987 930 Turbo, original paint, original matching numbers. And the damn thing became so valuable that I was afraid to drive it. And so, with some pain in my heart, we sold it and put in a pool in the backyard. So that was a good trade. My first car at Tulane University was a 1973 Triumph TR6. And so when I sold the monster Porsche, I bought a 1976 TR6 in original factory canary yellow. I don't know what they call it, but it is such a fun car. I've got a cam in it. It's three Weber two-barrel carburetors. It's like the go-kart of your dreams. I just love that little car.
Although they weren't renowned for performance
No.
compared to the five and the four, etc. And of course, they had the legendarily extremely innovative but not very good fuel injection.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really clever engineering, that fuel injection they had, but it just didn't work very often.
Yeah. No, it's a proper car in the sense that like my kids wouldn't know how to drive it. It's a four-speed. You have to crank this knob to put the windows up and down, and
Yeah, yeah.
it's just sort of proper motoring. Now you've got quite the cars. I mean, really incredible.
Well, I spent most of my silliness racing old cars, and most of these pictures are cars that I've raced or used to own or whatever. But I don't really do that now, so I'm restricted to road cars. So and just for convenience of or simplicity, they're all Jags. So I have three E-types and a saloon. So, but I have different types of E-types. So, and they're all from the obviously early '60s, etc.
Yeah.
Although my saloon or sedan Jag is a family car from the '50s, which it's been in the family since new.
Hmm.
So, which I
And
dragged.
one of them you drove across country, right? You had
Yes. Yeah,
some work
exactly.
done in California and you drove the thing across the country, which is very cool.
Yeah, exactly. We drove from eldest son and I drove from San Francisco to Orlando in this one here, which was, in fact, that's the car in New Orleans. Um, just pulling into the hotel in New Orleans, and yeah, it got to Colorado where a bolt fell out of the bonnet that lifts up on an E-type. A bolt fell out in that, and then which was easy to put back in. And then the very, very last fuel stop in Florida, the starter motor broke. But they're light cars, so we bump started it, and it was fine. Uh,
This was the six cylinder or the 12?
Six. They're all
Yeah,
sixes.
six.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're all based around that legendary XK engine. So it was a 3.8. Uh,
Yeah.
Series 1 3.8, and I have a 4.2 Series 1, and then the third one, which is almost finished being built, is a 3.8, but a little more aggressive. So what do you think just going back to surgery, we discussed the fact that between 25 years ago and now it's wildly different. What do you think the next big thing is going to be in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, so if you look at the HER2 oncogene, which plays a role in so many solid tumors, I can see subspecialization based on the molecular phenotype, so that rather than a breast surgeon or a breast oncologist, rather, I'm a HER2 specialist. And with the explosion of antibody drug conjugates and other, highly, highly selective therapies, we may not be organ specific. We may really be, biology specific.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, there's a big, as you know, shall we call it a lively debate, going on between, for example, the College of Surgeons and ASCO, for example, where there is one view that cancer is a medical condition, versus what is obviously the college's view that it has increasing medical elements to it, but surgery is still a big driver.
Right.
I, I,
Right.
I'm not, and I mean, looking at this, not necessarily 10 to 15, but 25 to 50, I suspect the ASCO view may prevail in due course.
Yeah, with there's a paradox here because if you look at breast cancer, the impact of surgery is sort of parabolic. The earlier we get these things, the bigger impact surgery has. And then there's this peak where systemic therapies begin to do better and better. In hormone receptor negative, HER2 positive breast cancer, we see complete pathologic responses in 60 or 70% of tumors right now. So I still think the surgeon's role is important, that we've de-escalated the surgery. The thing that's a little bit worrisome to me, and we're talking about the next 2 to 3 years, is that there's all this political debate, not unlike our government, where it's suddenly uncool to recommend Operation A or Test B and I hate to see that. I really, as I go to breast cancer meetings around the country and I look at this, there's sort of these political factions, and it's intellectually dishonest and it's not helpful to anybody. So I'm sure rectal cancer has the same thing.
I'm sure, and I think there's a lot of it associated with what I often refer to as misaligned incentives as well. I mean, why are you in this business? And it's not. I mean, the easiest misaligned incentive is personal income, but it's not all about that. Actually,
Right.
it's about systems and one thing or another. So what would be your advice to the 25-year-old Pat Borgen at this stage, starting out?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I have a daughter who's a medical student, and she decided early on to go into psychiatry. And I think that's a really brilliant career choice because we're all a little bit crazy. There's probably a national need for more psychiatrists. I don't know if I would have her go into breast cancer surgery. I think it's a little bit of a shrinking pool of impact, if you will. Although I've loved every single minute. I chair something called the Miami Breast Cancer Conference, which is held every March at the Fontainebleau on Miami Beach. And we've got almost 2,000 doctors pre-registered for this meeting, and 60% of them are surgeons. So there's still a very critical role for us. There's still a very critical role, and for the foreseeable future. But as you said, 20 or 25 years from now, I'm not sure.
But do you think you'd have 2,000 people registered if it was in New Jersey?
Definitely not. In fact, I've been involved with this meeting for 25 years. I've been chair for about 13 or 14, and we can track weather patterns in the north and northeast, which right now we're having a hellish winter. So that's driving attendance, no question about it. I'd like to take credit for it as a clever guy, but it's the weather. It's really
Yeah,
the
for
weather.
sure. Location, location, location.
It is. It is. It's a fun meeting, and you would love it. It's totally interwoven with genetics, genomics, proteomics, surgery, radiation, radiology. It's all mashed together, which is sort of the way we have to practice. And it's very practical. It's not let me go over 100 clinical trials. It's what do I need to know on Monday when I get back to work? And so I really got to have you down.
Anytime. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's Miami in the winter is what it's all about. That's
Yeah.
for sure. So let's pivot to some serious questions now, and let me start by asking you, What's the best book you ever read?
Probably Barbara Kingsolver's Poisonwood Bible. Barbara lived in Congo for 20 years. She worked on this book for 20 years. Have you read it? Are you familiar
Oh,
with it at all?
I'm not.
Yeah, it's a fabulous, it's an epic story of a Christian minister and his family that go to bring religion to the natives and only discover that the natives have a lot more spirituality than they have. And it's just a fabulously crafted book, Poisonwood Bible.
Huh. And the best movie you've ever watched?
Chinatown, Jack Nicholson. I still enjoy the twists and the turns. The acting is spectacular. The writing, um, I think it was Roman Polanski. It was just an amazing, amazing, amazing film. Chinatown.
I've never forgotten the episode.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
And
that's a
the
little hard to watch, but great, great story, great twists, and every time you think you know what's happening, you just don't.
So one of the reasons I've never forgotten that is when I was a young resident, I worked in an inner city hospital in Dublin, and Dublin doesn't in those days particularly, but still, gun crime is not a thing there because there's not really guns in Ireland, but knife crime is regular, and some sort of casual knife crime was regular, associated with alcohol as well, and box cutters were the thing,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
just a Saturday dispute. And I
right.
vividly remember a guy standing in the emergency room, and somebody done a box cutter to his upper lip. But he was not feeling any pain because he'd had a few drinks and one thing or another, and this had stopped bleeding actively. But it was moist enough to be the perfect cigarette holder.
It's such an incredible memory. When I was a resident, a guy named Carter Nance was doing a trial of exploring knife wounds rather than taking everybody to the OR.
Yeah.
And they were randomizing people to either local exploration or going to the OR. Way ahead of its time. It was before peritoneal lavage and certainly before laparoscopy. And he was massively criticized by the trauma gods of the day. I remember Dr. Trunke, so they asked him for his comment on the paper, and he said, well, I hope if I'm vacationing in New Orleans and I get stabbed, that son of a bitch is not on call.
I,
So,
you know where that came from? That approach came from, if I recall correctly, a paper that was written from Witwatersrand in South Africa,
yeah,
where they simply had too many stabbings to operate on them all. And so they
yeah,
thought, listen, this is crazy. We can't operate on these people. And so
right.
they demonstrated, I think it was published in something like the BJS or something like that, showing that
Yeah,
if you could, you didn't have to operate on all of these
right,
people, you know?
right.
And,
Yeah.
then they took it west and went from there. It's
And the Western doctors took credit for it, of course.
needless to say, yeah. So Beatles or Stones?
Beatles, 1,000%. Um, I have been involved in the care of two of Paul McCartney's wives. Not a HIPAA violation,
No.
and I'm a big fan. Paul McCartney was one of the best care partners I've ever seen in my life. Made every appointment, was there, was there, was there. And plus, I love the music. Our band plays a lot of our band slaughters a lot of Beatles music. Um, I look at what those guys wrote at 19, 20, 21, 22, and I just don't understand the lifetime of it. Almost makes you believe in reincarnation because the life experiences that went into their music, I just find staggering.
I'm a huge Beatles fan and a big McCartney fan. I mean, even though he's not short of ego, but he's one of the genuine geniuses,
Yeah.
just an extraordinary talent. But what's amazes me is the sheer size of the body of work that
Right.
he and John Lennon and the rest and the two others as well. But it's an enormous. It's not like they wrote six
Right.
songs and two albums. Number one, and the other thing I thought was fascinating was that Disney series or the program about the making of Let It Be. Um,
Yeah.
to watch them do
Right.
that was just
Right.
extraordinary because
Right.
as a listener, you always think, oh, they just, two takes and they were done.
Yeah.
Every note was agonized over, watching them do that for this simplest thing. And the way they did it, I mean, it was just bizarre, just sitting around, but there was a method to it all.
Yeah. I remember having a very brief conversation with McCartney. His first wife, Linda, had her cancer had been watched forever.
Sure.
She was a VIP and she got the worst care.
Yeah.
And by the time she got treated, she had 30 positive lymph nodes, and it was not much we could do back then. But I had the chutzpah once to just ask him, what are the chances of getting these geniuses together? And he said, it's a total misunderstanding. We were so competitive with each other that we always wanted to outdo each other. And we were each other's stimulus and motivation. And now you got to admit that they're geniuses, but they worked really hard at what they did. They worked really, it's amazing.
Yeah, there's a
Amazing.
great little uh great little clip of Ringo Starr saying that he was around at John Lennon's house and the phone went and both of them said to each other, "Oh my God, it's Paul wanting to work." He said, and
Yeah.
both of them said, "Let's not answer it. Let's."
Well, someone once asked if Ringo was the best drummer in the world, and the answer was he's not the best drummer in the Beatles.
Exactly.
McCartney was probably a better drummer.
So a Super Bowl or World Series if you're given tickets.
Um, Say that again. The what?
Super Bowl or World Series. You get free
Gosh.
tickets.
Yeah, free tickets. If my New Orleans Saints are in it, I'm a Super Bowl guy. They've only done it once in my lifetime. I happen to be a New York Yankees fan, and I've been to some Yankees World Series games, and they're very, very exciting. In general, I think I'm more passionate about baseball than football.
Uh, Beach or mountain?
I definitely beach, not because I give a damn about the sun or the sand, but I would fish. I would be surf casting.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, is there one person in the world who you really admire and would like to meet?
Boy, that's a really good question. I I'm very lucky that people like Murray Brennan are on my speed dial. He's probably the human being that I hold in the highest regard just based on his accomplishments and his humanness. He was never perfect, but he was so focused. Umberto Veronese was the same way. Veronese, in those 2 minutes you talked to him, he looked into your soul and you felt like I'm the most important thing in the world at this moment to Veronese. And both Veronese and Brennan had this charisma that allowed them to just really connect on a different level. So probably my two biggest heroes of my career.
And if you could invite any two people from history to dinner on Friday night,
Gosh, that would be hard. It would be easy to say Einstein, but we got to spend a little bit of time with Princess Diana. She decided at some point she was never going to wear a dress again that she wore with Charles. And so she gave the dresses to Christie's. They auctioned them, and the money went to breast cancer research. And I spent 3 minutes talking to her. I'd love to go back, and I just thought she was a fascinating historical character. Again, so much charisma, you felt it in your bones.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting her briefly when I worked in London, and I was running the HIV surgical service in Imperial, and she came to visit, and she just captivated people, including the people who said they're not royalists. You know, I don't believe in the royal family. Then she just walked in, as you say, she had great charisma. And who would you sit beside her at the dinner table?
Wow. Such a good question. I might go back to when I met her very briefly at the Christie's auction, and Evelyn Lauder, who was our grand patron, was introducing her to people, and she said, "This is Dr. Borgen, who does the surgery." And she said, "Oh, so you remove the bits?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I do." And she said, "Well, how does one decide on a career removing bits?" And I said, I just mumbled. I don't,
Yeah.
if bits are broken, you remove them. But I just remember being tongue-tied. I don't think it's ever happened in my life. We felt her presence walk into that auction hall before we saw her. You could just sense that energy. Who would I sit next to her? Well, if I sat Umberto Veronese next to her, he would try to pick her up. So that would probably not be a good thing. I don't know. Politics in America has gotten nasty and ugly and crazy. I was a pretty big Ronald Reagan fan back in the day. I probably started losing faith around the Reagan era. So I might set Reagan next to her. He was an interesting guy.
Last question, probably appropriately. What happens when we die?
Yeah, I don't know. I grew up Roman Catholic. I really like to believe that there's something afterwards, but I'm a skeptic, and so I struggle with that a lot. I guess I've gotten a little more religious as I've gotten older. I have two sisters that are passionate daily mass Catholics, and I admire them for their faith and the depth of their commitment. But every day I have new questions.
I'm always reminded of the story that Murray Brennan told me many years ago, and it wasn't his story, but one of his colleagues in Memorial told this story about a man arriving unexpectedly at the gates of heaven on a Friday evening, and St. Peter meeting him and saying, "I'm sorry, you don't appear to be on the list here." And well, I'm sorry, I wasn't expecting to be here, and the guy says, "Well, maybe you're on the emergency list. Let me just check." So he checks the emergency list, and he goes, "No." He says, "You're not on the emergency list either." He said, "It's hard to know. I can't really explain it." And then St. Peter says to him, "Wait a minute. You weren't on chemotherapy, were you?"
That was a Murray Brennan story?
Yeah, Maury too. But it wasn't his story, but I wouldn't want to repeat which world famous attending surgeon in Memorial whose story it was.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Well, Pat,
great.
listen,
That's great.
thank you so much for, I really appreciate it. As you may know, if you've watched any of the previous episodes, these come out, every 2 or 3 weeks, and it'll be launched onto the airwaves and the listening waves in due
Yeah.
course. I really appreciate you taking the time.
I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate you. I remember the pain of your trek to Brooklyn. And I was in the parking lot when you got out of your car, and you were like, "What the hell did I agree to do?" But um, your was important. It's important that we offer the same level of services that the Memorial Sloan Ketterings offer, and we can only do that by being self-critical
Sure.
and working at it. So thank you for everything.